Welcome. Welcome back. If you have been here before to Areopa webinars, I've added a number 17. We've already 17 sessions since last July when we started. And I'm happy to have Tobias Fenster with us, a good friend, MVP colleague also, and he will present today on interfaces in AL, one of the great new technical features. Maybe something that guys like Mark Brummel have been waiting for long. And yes, there were kind of ways in C-side to mimic interfaces, but now we really have an interface object. Toby, I know Toby from a long time ago at Informa, a German partner in Ulm. He joined Cosmos last October as CTO for this big company. And he still finds time to share things with us like today. So big welcome to you, Toby. Before I hand over the thing to you, I will go through the normal housekeeping rule slides and etc. Anybody joining in for the first time, this might be new. Your mic is muted and will stay muted. If you have questions, please use the GoToWebinar question window. I'm the moderator for today. By the way, my name is Luc van Vugt. You might know me. And I will pose the questions to Toby, especially if they apply to the, let's say, the certain moment Toby is in his presentation. I will step in and post questions. I might save up a couple of later, but be welcome to put them in the question window. As you might know, we have Areopa Webinars channel on YouTube. We're getting close to the 300 subscriptions. Actually, 289 was late yesterday evening, but this morning I already saw one extra added. Well, help us move and get yourself registered as a follower to that. As you can see, we do have a own channel now with let's say a kind of shortcut URL, and yes, it's building up now as a quite nice library thanks to guys like Toby. If you want to be in the know, register yourself to our newsletter. It's not that descriptive, but it's not that long. You might find also a link on our website somewhere on the upper left side. You will find a link to the webinars newsletter. We will, well, let's say the normal rhythm, every once a month we are sending a newsletter out with the newly scheduled webinars. Having said that, these are the upcoming webinars. Well, Toby will be our guest on June 23 about automating and extending Azure DevOps, as we've been doing more and more as a community with Azure DevOps, and there are a couple of things you can do straightforward, but as Toby will show, there's much more to be opened up. I think we've been doing short on ourselves for ages already. These things have been around there. You can do much more in your daily practice by automating. But before June 23, we have on June 9 other webinar on about preparing BC upgrade. It will have a couple of introductions, and John, Sarah, and me will be the panel that you can pose questions to. In the newsletter, we also post or positioned our webinars email address. Feel free to send in questions up front already. That makes it also easier for us to prepare. July 7th, not yet fully registered. We're busy with that, but Dimitri Katson, also one of our previous speakers, will present on enums in Business Central, especially now. Enums, the concept has been introduced already some time ago, but with Business Central 16, Microsoft has now refactored quite some parts, replacing options with enums. And of course, how do you upgrade your older installation to 16 in the context of enums? We keep on scheduling newer webinars, so we're always calling out to any of you that might be interested to be a speaker with a certain topic, or if you have a topic in mind, also share that. We might be able to find a speaker to do that. So yes, I think we can help each other on that. And we're almost at the point that I'm going to hand over to Toby. But before I do, I want to thank Fornaf, which I always do. But it's, yeah, I think it's just a logical thing. They make it able for us to do these webinars. Toby, it's to you. Enjoy it.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for having me. I hope you can see the screen with the introduction slide as well.
Yes, you're in view.
Okay, perfect. So again, thanks a lot for having me. Thanks for joining to all the participants. As you can see, and I only now noticed that one, I had originally assumed to do this 1 week earlier. So if you're wondering, the date is wrong on my side, not on your side. But the topic is the same, interfaces in AL and in Business Central. So what I have prepared for today, as Luc already has introduced me, I won't spend any time on that one, so just go straight to the agenda. What I want to share with you is why do we have interfaces, a bit of kind of theory, why does it make sense, where does it help, how is it built? And then I want to spend quite some time on actually building a solution using an interface. So we're going to go step by step through the necessary things that we need to do in order to use an interface in an AL application. But first of all, why do we want to have interfaces? And the first answer to that one is componentization. I think it's almost 2 years or even more that Microsoft has told us that they want to start componentizing the base application. So the base software that Microsoft is delivering is no longer going to be a big monolith, but instead separated into components, and they've already started to do that. But if you really think about componentization, that only makes sense if you know how to define a component. Because if you want to have components, then yeah, you need to have some vehicle, some structure to make sure that everyone understands the same. If you're talking about a component like price calculation, for example. So it's very important to be able to define a component, and defining a component means to describe the purpose. So what is it actually doing? For price calculation, it's of course calculating a price, it's calculating discounts, it's calculating sums, whatever. And the component, typically, if you look at other programming languages and also the way that Microsoft has implemented it, it does not consider the implementation. So we only know that it's able to calculate the price, but just looking at the component, just looking at the interface, I don't know how it is implemented, and that's important. Because that allows you to think more easily and more clearly about the architecture of your solution. Because if you know that you have that amount of parts, of different parts and components, you have a better understanding of what your solution is actually doing. You have a better understanding of which parts are interacting when a user is doing something. So you have a better overview of the architecture of your solution. The second part that's important there is that when we have a component, then we can replace it. I try to make that visible by changing the golden price calculation with a blue price calculation, but the outline is still the same. It's still a square here, and the same would be true for an interface. The outline, the purpose of the component is still the same, so it should still be able to calculate a price, calculate discounts, calculate sums, whatever. But actually the implementation, what is happening inside of the component, can be something completely different. So this allows us to replace a component either at runtime, because maybe now I'm writing an invoice or creating some price for someone in Germany, and then I'm creating something for someone in Denmark. And once I need to do the German tax calculation, and then I need to do the Danish tax calculation. Or I have a standard price calculation for my standard items, and then for some other items I have advanced price calculation, something like this. So this would be the opportunity to use a different component, a different implementation of the same functionality at runtime. But also we can do something at design time. That would mean that, for example, Microsoft is offering a standard price calculation, but you decide that in your ISV solution or in your customer project, you want to use a completely different price calculation. So you just remove that particular price calculation that Microsoft has provided, because maybe it is an app already, it is an extension already. You just remove that and bring in your own component to do the same thing. It also closes one gap that we still have in the extension model, which is that you at the moment can't override standard code. And as far as I know, or as I've seen, that also won't be possible in the future. So we have the possibility to extend a lot, but we can't override standard code. But while for only some slight changes, that might be a lot of effort. But for bigger changes, it might make sense to just bring a whole new component in place of the Microsoft standard code if you need to just change the standard code that is already there because you have some industry-specific solution that just works completely differently. So in a way, you can use this to replace code as well. And then we have the option to extend the component. That also becomes a lot easier if you know what the component actually does, because you can look at it and find out what it does at the moment. So for example, I've added a price calculation with a forecast here. That would mean that you're very clear what your component does at the moment, and then you add a forecast functionality so that it can handle some artificial intelligence solution in order to forecast your pricing or whatever. So adding functionality also becomes a lot easier if you have a good idea of what the components are and you have them well defined in your solution. So that would be the idea of why we need components in order to be able to define them, to replace them, and to extend them. But also, it's a good architecture approach to do decoupling, and interfaces help there as well. Now, if you're coming from a different, maybe object-oriented programming language or background, then you know what decoupling is. So I don't want to spend too much time. But if you've always worked with CAL, where that wasn't really possible or not easily possible, I want to spend a couple of minutes to explain what this is. So if you imagine you have a sports evaluation report, so someone has asked 100 people what they like about some sports, then you would maybe have the get basketball evaluation and the get tennis evaluation to get the feedback there, and that could be directly coded into the report. Now this would be very, very tightly coupled because it's directly in the same code in that example, but of course we could do something like move out a basketball evaluation code unit and a tennis evaluation code unit and bring the code over there. So now we have at least, it's still very coupled, but we have some kind of decoupling by moving it out into different code units and bringing the specific code for basketball into the basketball code unit and the specific code for tennis into the tennis evaluation code unit. And while we're at it, we can then rename the function, because now it's a get evaluation. So we have the same in both places, and we're able to call them in an identical way. But again, they are still very much coupled. They are strongly linked together because the sports evaluation report still needs an instance of the basketball code unit to call the evaluation function there, and it needs to have an instance of the tennis code unit to get the evaluation there. Now, why is that the problem? Because if you imagine that someone is removing the tennis evaluation code unit because they don't like it anymore, or they want to replace it with something else, that will cause problems, because now our link is pointing to nowhere, and if someone hits that particular code path, they're going to run into trouble. So the solution for that is to use interfaces, and I'll show you step by step how this works from a conceptual level. Now, the first part is we need some kind of a definition what our component, in that case an evaluation code unit, needs to do. So we need to define an interface, and what that interface defines is that we want to have a component that is able to provide us with an evaluation. So it defines a function called getEvaluation, and now we know that whatever is implementing that particular interface is able to give us an evaluation of, in our case, a sport. Then we need to have an implementation list. So we need to make sure that we always know which implementations are available for us. There are different options how someone can do this, and in AL this will be an enum, as we will see in a minute. There's also other things like automatic discovery of those implementations that are readily available, but in our case it's an enum that we're going to use. And then we need a mechanism to call that particular component that is now the one that we want to use. And we need to implement some kind of a selection logic. So we know that now we want to use basketball and now we want to use tennis, and we can add further implementations as well. What that means is that the sports evaluation report only is coupled to the interface, and our components, the basketball evaluation and the tennis evaluation, only need to implement that particular interface. So we don't have a direct connection between those components anymore. We just have our evaluation report that knows there's something where it can get an evaluation, and our basketball and tennis evaluation code units just need to make sure that they implement that particular interface. They also need to make sure they are registered in the implementation list so that the system knows that there is a basketball evaluation and there's a tennis evaluation. And then the report can just look at the implementation list, find out which implementations are there, and then, of course, call the mechanism that is there for calling the actual implementation. So it can then look at the implementation list, get back the information. Now it's the time to use the basketball component, or it's time to use the tennis component, and then just call that one. But again, it's no longer directly linked, but it's going through an indirection, which might seem like some kind of overhead. But again, we're losing the direct coupling, we're losing the direct connection, so we are more flexible to add other stuff. So what we can do here is we can also use the evaluation interface in our coding. We no longer need to directly reference the basketball or the tennis code unit, but we are referencing only the interface, and we're calling the function that is defined on the interface. So that would be a completely decoupled model. Why are we doing this? Just imagine we want to remove an implementation as we've seen before. In that case, we would be removing the tennis implementation, but everything else still works. So whenever someone is looking at the implementation list, of course, the tennis implementation would be gone because it's no longer there, but the basketball evaluation or others that might be there is still working as expected. So we're still fine. We're not getting any compiler problems or runtime problems. Also, we can replace stuff. So if we just decide that we want to have a new tennis evaluation code unit, which is adding more advanced evaluation logic or whatever, then we just get rid of the old one, plug in the new one. It needs to make sure that it implements the interface. It needs to register with the implementation list. And it needs to make sure that the mechanism that is selecting the currently valid component knows that there is a new code unit and under which circumstances it's to call that one. We can also add new ones. So if we add, for example, a soccer evaluation code unit, then all it needs to do is it needs to implement the same interface. It needs to register with the implementation list, and it needs to make sure that the calling mechanism knows that it's there. So when it's time to evaluate soccer, then it can call that particular code unit. And also we can a lot easier extend. So if we decide that we not only want to have some textual evaluation information, but we also want to have a graph that is returned, we can just extend our interface. The compiler will let us know that there are a lot of code units that are no longer adhering to the interface because the getGraph function is now missing. We can go through those code units and implement the getGraph function. And then we can, in our report, directly call not only getEvaluation, but we can also call getGraph and get the new functionality. And we don't need to dig through whatever distributed code is there, but we very clearly know, okay, this is the place where we have extended our interface. This is the place where we need to add something new. We can go through all the places in our code and add the new stuff. So that's it for the theory, so to speak. Why does it matter? Componentization, decoupling, and the things that we can go from there. And I've already introduced to you the idea how it is built. And what I now want to do is to go through a full demo. So we're going to define an interface. We're going to implement that interface in different ways. We're going to look at the implementation list and the handler. We're going to use the interface. And in the end, we will create an additional app or an additional extension that will add a new implementation for our interface. And I will need to switch to VS Code to show you what we're gonna do.
Toby, before you do, I have a question from René Welmerink, and he asks, why should we use an interface instead of an event? That's an interesting question.
Absolutely. The problem with events, at least from my point of view, is that they are not really binding. So you can have publishers, and then you can optionally subscribe, but you can't really make sure that anyone else is subscribing. You also are not 100% sure who is subscribing. There are things like the handle pattern that helps you with that, but then it's also that everyone needs to adhere to that pattern, and you can't really make sure. So from a technical perspective, it's something that looks similar, but it's really more stable. It's more robust, and you can really make sure that whoever is using your code or is extending your code is doing the things that they need to do. Of course, you can maybe document that you need to subscribe to those 5 events and adhere to the handle pattern. And if you do all this, then it works. But this is really something that the compiler will let you know if you're missing something, or if you add a new event, it can be difficult to find it out. Whereas if you add a new function in your interface, then the compiler will let everyone know that they need to implement that particular functionality.
Thanks.
Okay, so now let's go to the demo. I have prepared a workspace. As you can see here, that one has a base implementation where we will do the first stuff, and then we have an additional implementation where we're gonna do the additional implementation in the end. As an up.json to show you that I'm only depending on the base application by Microsoft. It's 16.0, so it's on the newest version, and we're gonna use that one to get up and running, and to just quickly show you the launch.json that is configured to a instance that is running somewhere in the cloud. So we're gonna use a container that is running there. So with that, I'm gonna start with a new file, and I'm going to name that base implementation, blatantly disregarding any naming convention that you might have heard or seen, but for the sake of this demo, that should still work. And I've lost it. Here we are. So now we have the base implementation, and first of all, we're going to implement an interface, and I'm going to use the interface snippet, the standard Microsoft interface snippet that's already there, and we're going to name that one sports evaluation. So now there's nothing more that we need to do. We have our interface defined. So this is the base information that we need. And as we've seen, we want to have a get evaluation, and that one is supposed to return a text. In order to maybe easier follow, I've added the demo stuff in VS Code so you can see where I'm typing and clicking. I hope this is not irritating here. So this is all we need to do to define our interface. And as you can see, as I mentioned in the beginning, this has no implementation at all. So we only know that it has a procedure that is called get evaluation, and it's returning a text. But we don't know how this is implemented, whether this is calling a web service, looking at some tables, or just returning a simple string, as we'll do in a minute. We just don't know yet. So how do we create the implementations? For that, we will add a code unit, and I'm again using the standard snippet for that one. Getting an idea. And because I'm a basketball fan, we'll start with basketball, and we'll say it implements our sports evaluation interface. Now, we already get the compiler telling us that we're not implementing the member get evaluation. That means that we're not implementing the procedure that we have defined in the interface. So the code unit says it wants to implement the sports evaluation interface, but it's not actually doing the thing that it needs to do, which is implementing that particular function. And I've heard that Microsoft will provide a quick fix for this. So you can see at the moment there's no quick fixes available, but it should be possible to add a quick fix that would just add the signature of the functions for you. But for now, I'll just copy that one, paste it here. So now we have the implementation. And as you can see, it's no longer warning that the sports evaluation interface is no longer implemented because we now have the function in place or the procedure in place. Of course, we need to declare a body. So let's do that. And we'll just return a string. Again, this could be something a lot more fancy, calling external components, complex business code, whatever you can imagine that you can put into a code unit could happen here. Now, this is our first implementation, but if we have only one implementation, it's not that much fun. So we'll also create the next one. And this is my second hobby. So because I'm doing this, I'm free to add whatever sport I want. And I'm adding that one and provide an evaluation. And I'll scroll up a bit so you can see. So now we have an additional code unit, which is able to, oh, actually it isn't. We need to add the implements sports evaluation. So that one is implementing sports evaluation as well. It's following the same structure. It's implementing the function or the procedure that is defined in the interface. So now we're able to call that one. As I said, we also need to have kind of a list of all the implementations that are there. And for that, in Business Central, we do have an enum. And we'll call that one Sports Evaluation Provider because it's providing us with the implementation. And again, I need to add the implements so that it knows for which kind of interface this enum is handling the implementation. What I could do here is I could add a default implementation. So I could say whenever there is no other logic that governs which implementation we want to use, then we could always use the basketball implementation. But I don't want to do that at the moment, just to show you that this is possible. So we're going to add a default enum member here, and we will let it know that we want to have an implementation again for the sports evaluation interface. And that one, the default is going to be basketball. So this would be enough to register our basketball code unit, but we already have more. So let's add not only the default, but also a selectable basketball member of the enum. So I can explicitly change this one to basketball. If maybe at some later point of time the default changes, then I can make sure that I've explicitly selected. And then we can also add our other implementation. That would be the tennis implementation. And we have that one here as well. So with that, we have now our interface. We have two different implementations, and we have an enum that knows that those implementations.
Toby, while you're typing, I got from two people more or less the same question. It shows IntelliSense that there are more interfaces available while you're working on one. What's the reason for that?
Well, the reason is that Microsoft is using interfaces already in their base implementation. I think the most prominent one, if I switch over here and just show you that one, is the price calculation one. And you can see that the others are connected to price calculation as well. Actually, if you go to the standard documentation, you will find a quite good explanation of what they have done. So this is the first point where Microsoft has used an interface to define a component, which is the price calculation component. They have the V15 implementation. They have the V16 implementation. So with that, they didn't have to remove the 15 implementation, but they just kept it. They added a new implementation, the 16 implementation, which is the default now, but you are free to select whichever implementation you want. And if you have your own price calculation logic and you always ended up changing a lot of code units and tables and stuff like that, now you're able to just implement that interface, register it in the same logic that we have. It's a bit more complicated than what I will show you, but basically the structure is the same, and then you can have your own price calculation. And I would expect that Microsoft will be using a lot more interfaces to define components. As they have announced, there is componentization going on in the base application, and they for sure will do this using the new method.
Clear, thank you.
Okay, so now that we have the enum, we also need a way to define which one we want to use, and for that I'm going to use a very simple table for setup. So this is going to be my sports evaluation setup table. Again, this could also be something where we're going to call an external web service or look at the data that is presented or something like this. But for now, I want to keep this very simple. So I'll just add a table with exactly one field, which has my selected sports handler. And this one is using the enum that we just defined. And that's it. So now we have a field that we can later fill with data and then make sure that and that one is going to be used. We also need a page in order to be able to change the data in that particular table. So this is going to be my sports evaluation setup table. As a source, it's going to use the table that we just defined. Sports evaluation setup. And all I want to do is add a group for the implementation setup and have a field which shows the selected sports handler. So here we are. So really, this is the most trivial implementation that you can think of, a setup for implementation handling. We just add the information in a table, and we will change the information that is in that table. And depending on the value that's there, we're going to use that particular implementation. So that is the last piece that we need to add, which is a code unit, which is doing the management of our code. So you can do a sports evaluation management code unit. That one will need a procedure called get handler, and that one will get a variable sports evaluation, which is of the type of the interface. So we're gonna add in an interface variable, and we'll see in a minute how we're gonna use that. And then we will find out which of the implementing components we want to use and set that as a selected handler. So for that, we need to have our sports evaluation setup table. So I'm gonna use a record of type. Sorry, I need to put this in the vars, not in the implementation. Our sports evaluation setup. So this is the table that we just created, which is able to find out which implementation we want to use. And then we have our enum for the provider. And then the logic, again, will be very easy. We just use the record and look at the first line. Again, in reality, you would probably do something a bit more complicated, but just to get the idea across. And now we know that as a sports evaluation, which is the interface variable that you can see up here, that one will be whatever is selected in our setup table. And if we have nothing in here, we can always use the default. Okay, so with that in place, just to get quickly through the things that we've just done, We have implemented the interface. We know it has a get evaluation procedure. We have two code units, the basketball code unit and the tennis code unit, which implement that particular interface and give back some data. We have an enum that knows which implementations are there, the basketball implementation and the tennis implementation. And we can also see that the default is basketball. Something I also should mention is that we have set it to extensible true. So we can add an additional implementation in a couple of minutes. And then we have the logic to find out which of those implementations we want to use. This is the sports evaluation setup, a table and a page. And we have the code unit that just looks at that particular page and gets the functionality done. Now we are able to use that one. And I will again create the easiest possible implementation. I'll just extend the customer list. Customer list extension, which extends the customer list. And all I want to add is an action. So as the first one in the general section, I want to add a new action called sports evaluation. That one should be visible in all areas. Let's make it promoted so we can easily find it. And maybe also make it big. And then what it should do is on action, we just want to call our implementation. Now, first of all, we need to have the sports evaluation interface. So we're adding a variable here. Let me scroll that. Sports evaluation of type interface sports evaluation. And then we need our management code unit, which lets us know which of the components that we have in place, or which of the implementations that we have in place we want to use. So we use the sports evaluation management code unit here. And then it's as easy as asking the management interface to get the right implementation. So now our sports evaluation interface variable actually is either a tennis implementation or a basketball implementation, depending on the setup. And now I can just show the text, get evaluation. So with that setup, which took us probably something like 10 or 15 minutes, we're already done. We're up and running. I will save everything and try to publish and see if that hopefully works. So it has compiled, it has created the app. It's publishing to my container. And then I hope we can see it up and running in a second. Oh, I need to get the password for the container because it will ask me to log in a second. Here we are. So now we are in the customer list page. We don't have anything set up, so we would expect the default to be used. So we should see the basketball implementation come up as soon as we get a reaction. Let's see. Here we are. And we should have our sports evaluation action. And indeed, it's the basketball is cool because we don't have anything set up, so the default is used. Now, if we look for the sports evaluation setup page, that one doesn't have any data, so we will create a new record. We don't want to use the default one, but use the tennis one. And we get back here and call the sports evaluation function again. And then we can see that, of course, tennis is fun. So we have changed the implementation because we have changed the setup table, and now a different component is used. We didn't need to change the source code because we've used the interface variable to call our code, and just in the background, it was changed to use the tennis implementation. Of course, I can now switch back and forth, but I think you can imagine how that works. So now we have a base implementation, we have an interface, but let's imagine that someone else comes around and decides that this is a nice idea. I now want to add my own component. I don't want to use the tennis or the basketball one, but actually I want to use a soccer implementation. How would that work? Let's go back into our product and into our project, and we have the additional implementation already prepared. That one now needs to have a dependency on the sports evaluation, as you can see here. Let's download symbols. Okay. And if we add a new file here, additional implementation, now we can just implement our new code unit, which is the soccer implementation. And again, we want to implement the sports evaluation interface, and we're gonna remove all that. And for the sake of time, I will just copy that one and put it in here. And because I'm not a soccer fan, we will do it like this. So now we have our additional implementation. That one is adhering to the interface, so that's fine. But we need to let Business Central know that we have a new implementation for our interface, and that is done through the enum. So now we can do an extension of the enum. And that would be to add soccer. It extends our already existing sports evaluation provider, and then we will add a new value with the same ID as the enum and name it soccer, and then we will just add the implementation information. We want to implement the sports evaluation interface, and we want to use the soccer one. So with that, we're already done. There's nothing more we need to do. I will just publish that one to Business Central again, which need to stop the other one and publish again. So now we have the additional implementation. That should hopefully show up in a second. And if we again go into the setup page, then we should now be able to select the soccer implementation. Let's see. Here we are. Let's look for the sports evaluation setup. Now that one has a soccer implementation. Yes. And if we go back in here and look at the sports evaluation, we can see the text that we've just defined. Now, if we also look at the extensions that are installed, you can see that we have our base implementation and the additional implementation. So we have the sports evaluation and we have the sports evaluation at soccer. So what you could now do, if you disagree with my assumption that soccer isn't the best sport in the world, you could just uninstall that extension, add your own soccer evaluation which says soccer is the best, and then you could use the same. So that way, without changing my code, without going through any events or something else, you could just remove my implementation and replace it with another implementation. Or if I was to add the get graph, as we've seen before, we would get a lot of compiler errors that tell us that the implementations that are already there need to implement get graph as well. And if we get the quick fix that I mentioned in the beginning, where it would just be one click, then we could very easily add additional functionality into our sports evaluation interface and use that functionality from everywhere else. So that's it for the demo. If I switch back to my presentation here, we've gone through those steps. We've defined the interface, we've implemented it. We created the implementation list, which is the enum. We've created our management code unit, which we use as a handler. Then we use the interface in the action, and we added a new interface, or we added a new implementation for the soccer evaluation. Now, just to quickly recap, why do we want to use interfaces in AL or in Business Central? The base idea is to have componentization. We need to have some way to define a component if we want to componentize. If we're at that point, we can easily decouple. Why do we want to decouple? It lessens complexity, and it also helps us a lot when we want to add or remove or replace components, and it also makes it a lot easier to extend. And why we've now looked at it that way, you can also look at it the other way. So if you want to extend something in Business Central, or if you want to add, remove, or replace something, then it makes a lot of sense to decouple that particular component so it gets easier. And again, if you want to decouple, then you're looking at componentization, you're looking at interfaces. So whether you're coming from the componentization standpoint or you're coming from the extension, adding, removing, replacing standpoint, the answer is interfaces. And also to recap, how is it done? You have your interface, which defines the procedures. You have your implementations, not only one, but probably a couple. Those implement the interface. And when you actually want to use this, you have the place in your code where you want to call the implementation. You then have some kind of an implementation management, which defines some kind of logic or setup or external influence that makes the decision which of your implementations you're now going to use for your interface. You get the answer. In that case, it's the golden one. You get that back to the caller. The caller is still using the interface variable sports evaluation. So it doesn't use the basketball evaluation variable, but it's still a sports evaluation. But the actual code that is happening is coming from the basketball evaluation. So this is it that I wanted to share with you for interfaces. I also want to make you aware that there is a session on interfaces at the 2020 Wave 1 virtual event for Business Central. And I've added the link here. Now that I look at it, I recognize that I forgot to put the date. That one is happening on June the 3rd. So next week, there is the virtual event. It doesn't have only information about interfaces, but it has the broad overview of what is new in Business Central coming from the project managers at Microsoft. So this is the official virtual event, the launch event for the 2020 Wave 1 release. And there will be one session on interfaces. And I'm pretty sure that the guys from Microsoft will show you additional wrinkles and additional ideas how to use them, how to get them to good use. And I hope they are also sharing a bit about their plans for the future where they're going to use interfaces. But let's see what is happening. I think it very much makes sense to take part in that event and look at what they're going to share. But I also think that those will be recorded so you can watch later. So this is it from my side. Thanks a lot for your time. Thanks a lot for watching. And if we have additional questions, Luc, let me know.
Yeah, thank you, Toby. Was loud and clear, you could say. I've got a couple of questions. A couple we did already answer in between, but some were not, let's say, fully on the topic at that moment. First question on the list is from Jan Hoek. He asked if he did miss something, but is there something like a naming convention for interfaces like we have in .NET? Is there something already defined for us in AL?
Yeah, I think Microsoft has decided to not put an I in the beginning like you probably used from .NET. I actually built the sample previously in a way that it was called I Sports Evaluation because I'm coming from a .NET standpoint as well. But then I got some feedback from Microsoft that they're not going to use that kind of a naming convention, but instead it is just named as the thing that it's doing. So Sports Evaluation would be a appropriate name for an interface.
So it doesn't, in that sense, doesn't look different from a function as such, or
a code unit, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, clear. Thank you. Question from Dimitri, and you did explain it somehow, but I can understand that that's the basis of his question. What is now actually the border between an interface, that you're using an interface, or just the fact that we decouple by putting our code into an extension?
Okay.
So
An
could you
extension would
clarify
be,
a bit on that?
yeah, I'll try. An extension would be the extreme of decoupling, because now it's kind of a different software package. But an interface could be a part of the same software package that just gives you the outlines of a functionality. So if you're looking at component design in maybe object orientation, usually you define a component by looking at something that has the same outline. So if you have a common interface, if you have common things that something needs to do, like calculate a price or get an evaluation, then this is something that is an interface, that is a component, and then you put an interface in front of it, so you can later exchange it, extend it, add new implementations, that kind of stuff. So if you look at extensions, those could be completely unrelated things that are put together in a software package, while something that you put behind an interface usually is a component that provides some functionality that is bound together. So the differentiation really would be that your interface probably wouldn't contain everything that an extension contains, but instead it's really some a component, some part of your application that is bound together, and you put just an interface in front to make sure that you can always identify where it is used.
Thank you. Another question from Jan Hoek. Can interfaces implement interfaces?
I don't think so. Actually, an interesting question. I looked at the question whether we can implement multiple interfaces, and the answer to that one was no the last time I looked, but I haven't looked into interfaces kind of extending other interfaces. I would guess not, but let me just quickly try or switch back to that one. So if we define a new interface, for example, here, interface, and then we would probably need to say something like implements or extends. No, there's nothing. I don't think so. I think you can only define an interface once and then have an implementation from it at the moment.
Clear. Next question was from Jaromir Shaluka. I will read out exactly what he was writing. I noticed that the V16 price calculator interface still uses old or obsolete sales price and sales line discount tables instead of the new price list line table. Do you have some idea, or do you know when Microsoft will provide us within full capabilities UI for the new price list table page, or which we would be used for the new V16 price calculation? Are you in the know of that?
Only to a very limited degree. I've seen some communication around that one that said that with some of the CUs or the minor upgrades that are coming, that should be added, if I understood that one correctly. So we probably don't have to wait until 17, but I can't say more about it, and of course don't have any decision on that one, so you should really ask Microsoft that.
Yeah, clear. Let me see. My list is jumping somewhat. Question from Isha Kivor. Why was the parameter on the management code unit function var by reference?
Let's look at that one. That's a good question. All questions are good, but that one is particularly good.
We always say there are no stupid questions, but then still we would say this is a good question.
Yeah, it lets me know that I didn't explain enough. You can see here that we're putting in the sports evaluation, and then we're setting it up. So it basically assigns the implementation that we want to use to that variable. And if we then look at the usage, you can see here we have the sports evaluation. We pass it in, and then we use it. Yep. So by using a var here, we make sure that the interface variable is kind of connected to the actual implementing code unit. And by using that one here, we get the code that is happening in the get evaluation code in the implementing code unit. So we're kind of filling that interface variable with the actual implementation.
Yep. I had a question from Daniel Huiskuts. and we had a bit of a discussion, so I might misunderstand more or less what he is asking for, but let me see, which one do I pick up? Let's take the original one. Is it possible that one code unit can implement multiple interfaces, or is always implementing one interface?
It was one when I got the same question the last time. And let's see. Huh? Yeah, it looks like we can do multiple implementations now.
Okay.
It now looks like we can do price calculation. So we could have one code unit that actually implements multiple ones. I mean, something so distinctive, different like sports evaluation and price calculation probably wouldn't make sense. But I think you can imagine use cases where it does make sense. And it seems like Microsoft has added that since I last looked. Seems to be possible.
Yeah. A question from Raymond Stockel. Oh, now my list jumps, so I had to go back. Are there other better ways to change an implementation instead of changing setup data?
Yes. For example, you could just have one extension that is providing the implementation. You remove that extension and replace it with another one. So in that way, you would only have one implementation anyway. So the logic would be by removing and adding another extension, for example. Or you could imagine that you have an implementation. The old one is valid until the last day of December. The new one is valid by January 1st because there was some legal change or whatever. So you put both implementations already in place, and then you have some logic that knows, okay, this is before December 31st, then I'm going to use the old implementation, and now we're on January 1st, and it's going to use the new implementation. So you could do something like this, and really you're not bound by anything. Anything that is possible in a code unit, you can use to define the implementing code unit.
Clear. Question from Sasha Herman. Will extending an interface with an additional function break dependencies to other extensions?
Yeah, the idea is to have a code unit that adds another function which is not part of the interface, if I understand the question correctly. That wouldn't break. So if we do something like the procedure, something else, and then this one is still valid, so I don't get a warning. My interface only requires that I am exactly implementing the get evaluation procedure. I can't add parameters, I can't change the return type or something like that. I really need to implement that one, but I can have additional procedures in the same code unit.
Clear. Steven Renders has a question. What extensions are you using in VS Code to pop up what you are typing? Yes, that was my question too later on. It was nicely when you type, you can see.
Toggle screencast mode, and it actually isn't an extension, but it's a standard feature of VS Code. Okay. So you just put in toggle screencast mode, and then you get that one.
You have to turn it on.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's a nice one.
Yeah.
Let me see. We're running towards the end, but I think I can get all the questions done. You could say also a compliment from David Singleton. I really love this presentation. Very straightforward and easy to follow. Yeah. So thanks, David. And then I think this is going to be the last question from Holger Beran. Is there information from Microsoft about which interfaces are planned in the near future?
I haven't seen anything, but that is really something that I would hope for in the event next week. So I will definitely join that one and hope that they will share any plans, but I haven't seen any official documentation or anything like that.
Loud and clear. And we're at the hour. That's perfect. Wow. Thank you, Toby. Let me switch let's pick up the screen, so I'll have, let's say, the official thanks to everybody here. So Thank you, everybody, for being here. And surely to you, Toby, once again, thank you very much for this indeed very clear presentation. If you want to register yourself to our newsletter for what's coming up, or be part of the YouTube channel, you find the URLs here. The presentation probably will go live on YouTube somewhere tonight or tomorrow morning. Thank you very much, everybody, for being here, and see you again on, it will be the 9th of June on the next webinar. Bye for now.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for joining. Bye.